Hi everybody. In this lecture I'm going to talk about handling errors in Oracle Golden Gate. By the end of this lecture you should be able to set rules to handle the errors caught by Oracle Golden Gate processes. Use exceptions table to save the caught exceptions. And set rules to handle the TCP/IP errors. The last step you're expected to do when you configure the CDR is to configure the parameter files for error handling. Technically speaking, you can configure the parameter file for error handling in bidirectional configuration as well as in unidirectional configuration. Error handling is not technically needed for CDR operation. A CDR configuration can operate without handling the errors. However, error handling is especially useful in CDR configuration for two main reasons. Firstly, you define the rules that will apply in the errors that cannot be resolved by the CDR. Secondly, with Oracle Golden Gate error handling, you can define an exception table in the database that will be used to store all the records that caused conflicts by the replicate process. In this lecture, you will learn how to configure error handling in Oracle Golden Gate. I should point out over here that the errors that are raised by the DDL operations are handled by the parameter DDL error. You will learn about that parameter in the DDL replication lecture, not in this lecture. You use the rep error parameter to configure error handling in the replicate parameter file. For a CDR configuration, you use this parameter to assign rules for handling the errors that cannot be resolved by your CDR, or with errors that you don't want the CDR to handle them. For example, you may have configured your application to run in an Oracle Golden Gate bidirectional configuration environment, and you don't expect duplicate row conflicts to happen in the databases. In this case, you can configure the replicate parameter file to register duplicate rows conflicts in an exceptions table. If the unexpected error happens, you refer to that exceptions table to do your investigation and understand why those conflicts took place in the database. Rep error parameter can be used globally or for a specific table. We mean by globally that all the map statements that come after that parameter will obey the rules defined by the parameter. The parameter can be configured to handle the errors in the transaction level, and this will affect all the records in the transaction. Or it can be configured in the record level, and this will affect the record which caused the error. The syntax of the parameter may look a little bit complicated, but actually it has only two parts. In the first part, you define the error you want to handle, and this is called the error specification option. And in the second part, you define the response to that error. In the incoming slides, I will talk in more details about the errors and their responses that you can define in this parameter. Those are the error specification options you can define in the rep error parameter. First is the default, which sets the default response of all the errors that will take place in the map statements that come after the parameter. The second option is the default to, and this option simply defines the response when the default option is set to exception. The third option is to specify specific SQL error number. you can refer to the Oracle Golden Gate error message reference to look for the error numbers that you would like to handle. You can also use a user-defined error specified with the raise error option in a filter keyword within a map statement. You will see examples about those options later in the lecture. This is a list of the responses that you can configure to the errors that you want to handle. The default response is append, which simply means roll back the transaction and terminate the replicate process. You can use the discard option to write the operation to the discard file and continue processing. Exception option works with the map exception option of the map statement. It is used for saving the conflicting records in an exceptions table. The ignore option simply ignores the error. Retry op instructs the replicate to retry the offending operation. Transabort instructs the replicate to abort the transaction and reposition to the beginning of the transaction. Transdiscard causes the replicate to abort the transaction and writes its records to the discard file. Transexception works with an exception table, but it works in the transaction level, not in the record level, as is the case with the exception option. By the way, transdiscard and transexception options are mutually exclusive. Reset is not a response to an error. It is just used to remove error handling rules specified in the previous rep error parameter. I will show you examples of using those options in the incoming slides. The first example in the slide stops the replicate process for all errors except the duplicate record errors. It ignores them. The second example works as follows. The first line in the example is telling the replicate to look at every map statement and look for the map exception or exceptions only options in that map statement. If those options are defined in a map statement, then those rules will apply. If those options are not defined in a map statement, then the second rep error parameter will take effect, which is instructing the replicate to terminate. In this example, there is an exceptions map statement defined for the emp table. Therefore, if there is an error taking place in the operations on this table, it will follow the rule defined in this statement. But if the error happens in the depth table, the replicate process will just terminate. You will learn about exceptions map statement soon in this lecture. The third example applies error rules for the first map statement and then restores the default of append to the second map statement. In the first example in this slide, if an operation on a record within the transaction generates the error number 1409, the record will be discarded and the entire transaction will be rolled back. Other error types cause the replicate to terminate. In the second example, if the error number 1409 is raised by any record in a transaction, the replicate performs the specifications defined in the map exception clause for every record in the transaction. For the other errors, the replicate will append with error. Here we have examples of using rep error globally as a standalone parameter and as an option in the map statement. In the first example, if an operation in the SRC1 table raises error number 409, the replicate will ignore the error. As you see, handling this error number is defined in the map statement and globally in the second rep error parameter. the RIP era map option supersedes the global definition of handling the same error number. In the second map statement, if the record raises error number 403, the record will be ignored. If it raises error number 409, the records in the transaction will be discarded. Any other error will terminate the replicator process. In the second example shown in the slide, if the record in the map statement returns error number 400, the transaction will be discarded. If it returns error number 1401, the transaction will also be discarded. Any other error will terminate the replicator process. With Oracle Golden Gate, you have the option to save the errors and conflicts in an exceptions table. To use that, you use an exceptions map statement. An exceptions map statement is a map statement with either the map exception or exception-only option. First, you need to create the exceptions table, then use it within an exceptions map statement. In normal operation, the replicate will save the conflicting operations into that table. At minimum, an exception table should have the same columns as the target table. But typically, you add extra columns to save more information in them, like the operation date and time, the values of the before image columns, and the values of the current image columns. As normal, you use the call map option to save the required information in those columns. I will show you examples of using the exception table soon in the lecture. As I said earlier, to use an exceptions map statement, you have to use either the exceptions only or map exception options. But what's the difference between them? With the exceptions only option, you typically create two map statements for each source table. The first is a standard map statement that maps the source table to the actual target table, and the second is an exceptions map statement that maps the source table to the exceptions table. This option is valid for one pair of explicitly named and mapped source and target tables. In other words, wildcard symbols are not used to define the tables. The map exception clause is used in the regular map statement, the same one where you map the source tables to the target tables. The map exception option accepts the names of the source and target tables in the map statement to be wildcarded. Replicate maps all operations that generate errors from all of the wildcarded tables to the same exceptions table. Therefore, the exceptions table should have all of the columns in all of the wildcarded tables. You typically use the call map clause with the use defaults option to handle the column mapping for the wildcarded tables and use explicit column mappings to map any additional information. Now, basic question. Can I use the map exception option with a one-to-one map statement? Actually, yes, you can. Whatever applies for a wildcarded mapping still applies to a one-to-one mapping. I will demonstrate some examples of using those options in the incoming slides. This example assumes that the source and the target exception table are identical. No other columns are there in the exceptions table. With the exceptions only option, you use the insert all records option to convert all the operations into insert statements. This is an easy way to use the exceptions table in Golden Gate, but you will lack the information you need to analyze the errors, like operation date and time, operation type, etc. This is a typical example of using an exceptions table in the replicate parameter file. As you see, you use the SQL exec function to get the data of the current record from the target database. This will be executed by the replicate before processing the record in the trail file. The ColMap option is used to populate the columns that will store information about the transaction, like the transaction time and type. You have also columns to save the values of the before image column values. You use the before function to get the values of those columns. In addition to that, you have columns to save the values of the current record in the target database, and you refer to the query defined in the map statement to obtain the required data for those columns. I understand that this looks like a long code to write, but it has all the information that will assist you in your investigation if an unexpected conflict takes place in your configuration. This is an example of using the map exception clause with an exception table. As you see in the example, the map exception clause is used with the same map statement that's being used for the normal mapping between the source table and the target table. The exception table should have all the same columns as in the source tables, which their names start with TRX. The exception table also have more columns to save information about the errors. You can configure Oracle Golden Gate to handle the errors that are raised in the TCP/IP level using the file TCP/ERRS, which is located in the Oracle Golden Gate root directory, and it can be edited using any text editor. The structure of this file is simple. It has 4 columns, and you edit the value of the last 3 columns to define how Golden Gate should respond to any TCP/IP error. The first column in the file represents the TCP/IP error that you want to handle. In the second column, you define how Golden Gate should respond to the error. Possible values are retry or append. In the third column, you define the period of time Golden Gate should wait before it tries to reconnect again. In the last column, you define the maximum number of reconnect attempts before the process aborts. You may need to tweak this file if you have an unstable network or a network with high latency. And that's all about handling errors in Oracle Golden Gate. In this lecture, you learned how to set roles to handle errors caught by Oracle Golden Gate processes. Use exceptions table to save the caught exceptions and set roles to handle TCP/IP errors. In the next practice lecture, you will learn how to use exception table. See you over there. Thank you very much.